What is up, dudes? Welcome back. It's your boy, Random Internet Person, here today doing a couple more. We're going to start doing a series that I've kind of planned for some instructional flight training videos, in particular for private pilot syllabus. But depending on what kind of feedback I get, I may add some other things in there, whether it's for instrument or commercial too. As a lot of you guys know, I'm a commercial pilot and flight instructor in the Atlanta area. And when I was originally training for my flight instructor certificates, I did a couple of practice videos, which I included here. They're on my YouTube channel in a playlist that I've created called PPL Ground School. And they were mostly just to practice teaching and talking about the fundamentals of aviation, focusing kind of on physics and stuff like that. But after about 400 hours of dual instruction given, there's a few areas where I've found consistent sort of deficiencies with students struggling for performance. And I'm going to try to address those here because I went looking for videos to try to concisely, I guess, convey what I was trying to give them. And I couldn't find anything. I guess, ironically, I did find one video, which was a DCS. It was an actual F-18 Hornet pilot, which I'll link down in the description of the video, describing one of the things that I'm going to talk about today in the context of DCS. And it's something that's really underserved in the pilot community. And just to give you a hint, why your landings suck, in a specific boiled down reason, it's your trim situation. So I'm going to start here with my lift drag chart that I think you guys are probably familiar with from my earlier videos talking about the fundamentals of flight. And of course, we've got the red is total drag, blue is your induced drag or lift induced drag for short, and parasitic drag. And to go back a second, we talked about this before. Induced drag, the way that I describe this to people is like if you're, when you're a kid, you stick your hand out the window of the car while it's traveling, knife edge out the window. And what happens when you increase the angle of attack of your hand, right? You lift that leading edge or your thumb side of the hand up to increase the angle of attack, and your hand does what? It goes up and it goes backwards. So we've increased the coefficient of lift by increasing the angle of attack, but in doing so, that deflection of the control surface here, in this case your hand, causes drag. So the slower that we go, the less efficient the wings are, the airfoils are at creating lift, which means that we have to compensate and increase our angle of attack to increase the coefficient of lift. So slower we go, the more drag we're creating here, induced drag. Now, conversely, the faster that we go, if we just have our hand straight out the window, we start to accelerate the car. And of course, we're going to feel more resistance as a sort of product or a cost of moving an object through a viscous liquid, or in this case, air. You kind of view all of this through the lens of fluid dynamics. And down here on the back side of this, we could draw a third line over the top, and this would be your available excess thrust, or your available thrust, total thrust. And we're talking here, if we draw a line straight up from here, this area here is called the region of reverse commands. And I had this kind of faulty understanding of this when I was a student pilot, as being this area where once you get into this range, slower flight, the aircraft isn't capable of generating enough thrust to overcompensate or to compensate the increase in drag that we're creating, right? But the reality is, as you can see, unless you get down to your minimum controllable airspeed here, we have a lot of excess thrust. And in fact, it's pretty much the same as it is on the other side of the power curve, right? For simplicity's sake, practical application of the region of reverse command is that, hey, we're going to pitch for speed and power for altitude. And what does that mean with pitch, right? What do we do with pitch in the cockpit? Most of our, not most, all of our flight regimes, we're using trim for pitch. And what most people don't understand is the correlation specifically between trim and pitch and airspeed, right? So if we go over here to my little browser window before we get into that, let's look at this. And here's an example of something that you can do if you're a CFI or you're a student pilot or you're even a practicing private pilot. If you want to go out and test this in the real world, think about back to your initial solo flight training. I think one of the problems is, and the deficiency is, that most student pilots, and maybe even some private pilots, don't understand the correlation between that training regime and what ultimately happens when we get into the traffic patterns, is putting those dots together. And the reality is that, in fact, let's pull this up. Part 61, FAR 6187. Solo requirements for student pilots. There is Part D, maneuvers and procedures for pre-solo flight training in a single engine airplane. This is kind of a syllabus. I mean, it's not a syllabus. This is what the Federal Aviation Regulations require you to receive training in before you solo an airplane. And most of these pertain to giving you the skills to be able to fly traffic patterns. So let's look at some of these. Obviously, flight preparation procedures, yeah. Taxiing, surface operations, of course. Takeoffs and landings, yes. Straight and level flight, turns in both directions. Now we're kind of talking about what I'm getting at. Climbs and climbing turns, yes. Descents with and without turns using high and low drag configurations, yes. Flight at various airspeeds from cruise to slow flight, here's what we're talking about. And of course, ground reference maneuvers. Remember, a traffic pattern is, and a landing is, unless you're in an instrument conditions, a landing is a ground reference maneuver. In fact, I had a couple students who, kind of smartasses, but a clever answer. There was a question on their pre-solo written that said, are you capable, because we're at Class Delta airspace, it said, can you do ground reference maneuvers in Class Delta airspace? And these two guys independently don't know each other. They both said yes, because a traffic pattern is a ground reference maneuver, which is true. But getting back to my points about flight at various airspeeds, when we talk about slow flight, when you do it on your check ride, it's typically going to be in the context of a power off stall. So the way we're going to do slow flight on the exam is going to be a precursor to that power on stall or power off stall evaluation, which is in landing configuration. So we usually do it with flaps. But when we teach it, at least when I teach it, I start without flaps so that students can see that correlation between angle of attack, airspeed. And we go back to this little guy over here. What we're doing when we're in slow flight, we're in the region of reverse commands, but we're still in that safe area here. Tons of excess thrust available to us, but what are we doing? We're going to slow that airplane down. We're going to start to increase our angle of attack until we see a drop in altitude. I start to see that altimeter start to move, or our VSI start to decrease, in which case I'm going to start to add some power, right? All I'm going to do is keep trimming the airplane until I find that particular airspeed that I want. And then I'm going to add the power or remove the power as necessary to maintain altitude, right? So in that situation, we're on the reverse end of the power curve, but I've trimmed the airplane for a particular speed. And when I remove or when I add power, the plane is going to maintain that speed for me because we've trimmed an angle of attack. Now remember, we talked about angle of attack before. What most people don't seem to understand, it's certainly true of students, is remember your angle of attack is the difference between chord line and relative wind, or flight path as it were. So if we're in straight and level and slow flight, it's going to look something like this guy in the upper right hand corner. You can see our flight path is level, but now we've got this divergence between the chord line here from our airfoil and that flight path. That's a high angle of attack. What happens when we reduce power? Our flight path doesn't stay level anymore. Now the airplane is starting to descend, so it's going to look something like this. But the airplane is going to seek that angle of attack, that same angle of attack, so it's going to maintain that speed for us. Angle of attack, when we trim a particular airspeed, that trim speed is equilibrium, and the airplane is always going to seek that angle of attack. And what I was getting at before is this maneuver. This is called a Fugoid Oscillation. And you can go try this. If you're a student pilot who's solo, you want to go see what this is all about. If you're a CFI, I recommend doing this with your students. And even if you're a private pilot or commercial pilot, this is a good thing to go practice just to see these aerodynamics and work. So you can see pitch angle, attack angle, and departure from trim airspeed. So deviation from trim airspeed is the light gray. Our pitch angle is the black one. And our angle of attack is this line in the center. What's up, Melon? So what you can do, trim the airplane straight and level for whatever speed you want. You can start with a cruise speed. Maybe you're in a Cessna, 90, 95 knots, straight and level. If you press that nose down, go down to -8 degrees or something, what's going to happen? Without trimming the airplane, without changing the power settings, the speed is going to increase. And remember from those initial talks that I was doing before, the faster you go, the more efficient the wings are at creating lift. So we're going to get into this shallow dive at 8 degrees. The wings are going to start to create lift. And of course, all we're going to do, not pushing and pulling on the yoke at all, just use the rudder pedals to keep the wings level. Once you kind of get to the bottom of this, the wings are going to generate so much lift that the nose is going to start to come back up. Now you can see our speed, or deviation from trim airspeed. Now our speed's starting to come up as we're going down. As the wings start to push the nose back up, now our speed's going to start to come back down. Once it gets too low, the wings are going to come back down. You see this gradual convergence of the airspeed and the pitch angle back towards that neutral position. And one thing that remains relatively constant is the angle of attack. And ultimately, the plane is going to search for that neutral angle of attack. It's going to maintain that airspeed. So when you're at the end of this maneuver, the angle of attack and your airspeed are going to be pretty much where they were when you started. Your altitude might be a little bit lower, but you'll see that correlation between trim and angle of attack. The airplane's always going to seek that angle of attack out. And that's a big thing with landing that students don't seem to comprehend. They don't want to trim the airplane. And I actually asked one student, why don't you trim during landing? And he said that he was afraid that he was going to over trim the airplane. But the reality is, what you're doing when you're pushing and pulling is fighting the airplane. The airplane wants to go to that neutral setting that you've created, that equilibrium state. So as long as you're pushing, you're fighting the aircraft, and you're giving yourself an extra axis of command that you have to be responsible for during your landing procedure, right? Number one reason why people are inconsistent with their landings and why their landings are so crappy is because you're not trimming a particular airspeed, right? So let's talk about the traffic pattern. Let's say we get in here, where to go? We're on our downwind leg. Let's say we're in our Cessna 172. We're doing slow flight right now on the downwind leg. Say you're at 80, 85 knots. So you don't have flaps, you're in a clean configuration. You've got a little bit higher of an angle of attack to compensate for that. Your RPMs are probably somewhere in the ballpark of 21 or 2200 RPMs. Now, just to stop for a minute and go back, I had another student who flew with, what's up, dude? Gregory, thank you for the follow, my bro. I had another student who flew with a different instructor because I was busy one afternoon, and she came back and she said, one of the things that he told me that helps me, that you may or may not have told me, you might have forgotten, was set 1500 RPMs and just ride it all the way down. Absolutely wrong, right? So number one, I had another student who went to a check ride, and the DPE said, why did you set that particular RPM? Gory coach, what's up, man? The DPE asked, why did you choose this RPM setting? And he said, I don't know. The instructor told him, right? He assumed that it came from the POH. The POH doesn't give you an RPM setting. The RPM is not the goal. The goal is what's going on with our other instruments, right? What I want is to reduce the airspeed, retrim the airplane, and maintain a 500 foot per minute descent at the airspeed that I want. I'm only giving you an RPM as a general ballpark. And of course, sometimes when we're flying older airplanes, that tachometer is on the right side of the cockpit. So what do these students do? As soon as they make that power adjustment, they're looking over at the RPMs. They're staring at that instrument, and the plane is kind of drifting away from the runway. Because remember, this is a ground reference maneuver. In the FAA, section or chapter 3 of the airplane flying handbook, in the basic flight maneuvers, remember, this is called the integrated method. Right? It's basically attitude flying. 90% of our visual attention is going to remain outside of the aircraft. 10% of the time, visually, we're going to be inside verifying with instruments. So that first thing that we're going to do in the traffic pattern, once we get to a beam or landing point, whether it's the numbers, whether it's the 1,000-footers, we're going to make that first initial reconfiguration of the airplane for landing. So we're in our Cessna 172. I'm going to go ahead and put the carb heat on, and I'm going to make that initial power adjustment. So again, 1500, that's a decent starting point, but 99% of the time, I am not looking at the tachometer. I'm using my ears, and I'll verify with the other controls or the other instruments. And here's another good thing that you can do for practice, whether you're a student or you're a CFI training with other students. Go out, get yourself some altitude, and practice changing your power settings by just using your ears. You can tell what your normal cruise power setting sounds like, and you should be able to tell what that initial power reduction sounds like without having to turn your head over to the right or wherever your tachometer is and stare at your tach until you get that RPM. Because I don't care about the RPM. I care about reconfiguring the airplane. So that first configuration down here, beam the landing point, pull that power back to whatever setting it is. And remember attitude flying, right? 90% of what we do in VFR day conditions is attitude flying. I'm flying the cowling of the airplane to the horizon. So when I make that first initial power reduction, what's the airplane going to do in the context of what I was just talking about with trim? If we were flying 85 knots in the pattern, the plane is going to seek an 85 knot angle of attack. So what's that going to look like? Remember where? Here we go. 85 knots, that nose is going to drop because we've reduced our thrust, right? Now we have a deficiency of thrust. The airplane's nose is going to come down looking for that angle of attack. I don't want it to do that. So going back to our attitude flying over here, I'm going to let the nose come down a little bit. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is hold the nose on the horizon when I make that power adjustment to slow the airplane down. I'm going to keep this distance right here fixed. I'm going to get a little bit of rough back trim in, then I'm going to set my flaps. Then I can start to worry about what I got to do with the trim. I'll start to let that nose come down, right, using that natural horizon, that reference point that we've got. And you can see here now our horizon's getting a little bit bigger. It's going to want to drop probably a little bit more than you want it to. It's going to seek that 85 miles an hour. So you can hold a little bit of back pressure and trim the pressure off your left hand. We're just making that first power reduction. We got our flaps 10, and I'm looking for probably about 75 knots at this point. Once you've got that speed trimmed, now we're not pushing and pulling anymore in the controls. All I'm doing is keeping the wings level, make sure I'm tracking to my point fixed out on the horizon. The plane's going to keep flying that speed for you, and it's basically going to be the same thing all the way to the runway. What most students do is push and pull to try to get that airspeed, and it makes them incredibly inconsistent, right? Because they're fighting that natural inclination of the airplane to go back towards its equilibrium state. So you can make that first adjustment, reconfigure the airplane, holding the back pressure just to bleed the speed off, set your flaps, and start to trim for that airspeed you're looking for. Same thing once we turn our base. Right, we're going to reconfigure a little bit more. We're going to add some more flaps, and I'm going to add a little bit more trim to slow us down now, probably towards about 70 miles an hour, or 70 knots, or about 65 knots. Once we get 25, 30 degrees of flaps, that's generally all I'm going to use for landing. So all I got to do is make this last turn base to final, right? And then we can get a little bit more trim to get it down to our final approach speed of about 60 knots. The other thing is this distance from the runway to your downwind leg is going to be determined almost exclusively by the distance required for you in the event of an engine failure to be able to get to the runway with no power, to be able to do a power off 180. So if you're flying a 1.5 mile distance here, you lose engine power, that's too far. The other thing is the whole goal is to maintain a consistent 500-foot descent rate from the time that we make our initial power reduction here all the way down to the runway. So if you have a super wide pattern, think about how long your base is going to be. Ideally, if you could unwind and just stretch this final approach base leg and this last portion of your downwind to base into one line, it would look like a continuous 500-foot descent all the way down to the runway. So if you have a significantly longer base, you're going to be hitting that 500-foot AGL over here. That's too early, right? Same thing if we extend too far downwind. There's a couple other variables to keep in mind too. Think about the fact that this is a ground reference maneuver. When we're doing those turns around a point and S turns across a road, your bank angle is determined almost exclusively by what your ground speed's doing. A higher ground speed means a higher angle of bank. So when we're on the downwind leg, that's our highest ground speed. Because, ideally you're going to have wind straight down the pipe of the runway and it's pushing you. So if we wait too long to start turning our base leg, we're kind of extending ourselves down here, which is going to give us an incredibly long final approach. And you're not going to be able to maintain that 500 foot per minute descent rate. So kind of keeping it a little tight. And there's actually a good feature on ForeFlight that allows you to overlay a traffic pattern, a visual traffic pattern on satellite imagery. So you can go through your local airport or wherever you do your training, you can kind of see what a generic downwind distance, base length, and final approach length would look like. But the reality is, as long as we're trimming the airplane for these speeds, it's going to maintain them for us on final approach including, right? So all I have to do is use the power to control my altitude all the way down, ailerons for wings level, and then using the rudder pedals to coordinate our turns and to keep us lined up with that center line. And like I said, that biggest problem is people pushing and pulling, trying to find an airspeed with the elevator when they don't have to. You're just fighting the airplane, making things unnecessarily difficult for yourself. I talked about a couple of these things. Another big one on final approach is that reference point that we're using out the window. Students have this tendency to line up typically to the left of the runway. And when you're on the taxiway, give them that reference point, right? we want the nose wheel to be right on that yellow center line. So when you're when you're sitting in the left seat, it should look like that yellow line is right under your right leg. When you're on final approach, I'm not using the center line as a reference to determine whether or not I'm on the middle of the runway. Most of that reference are the sides of the runway. For example, if you're on center line, both sides of the runway are going to have an equal sort of angle drifting in towards the middle. If I'm left to center line, that left side of the runway is going to look a little bit straighter, and the right one's going to look more angled in towards the center. Same thing when you're driving your car. There's not a yellow line in the middle of the road that tells you where to be. You're kind of using the sides of the lane to guide you on the way in. They want to have some concise middle reference that they can use to line up with the runway, and it causes them to consistently line up left or right. In most cases, it seems to be to the left for whatever reason. You can see in this picture, they're right on the center line. But it looks like it's a little bit off center because we're seeing this from the pilot's view. Like for me, this looks fine, but I think for a lot of people, a lot of student pilots, it's kind of hard to find that center line. And they'll end up fighting me all the way down to the runway about where the center line is. The video that the F-18 pilot did that I linked, again, we're talking about that reconfiguration here at the top of it, where once you've got the airplane trimmed for a particular speed, it's going to fly it. But also remember, okay, we're turning, so we're exchanging a little bit of that vertical lift for horizontal lift. So he says, okay, typically before he starts to turn in, he'll add just a little bit of power to infuse a little bit of energy into that. So he's maintaining the altitude solely by pitch. In my case, again, we're going to kind of keep the throttle a little bit more constant. I'm just going to add a little bit of back pressure sometimes while we're turning. Once we're level, that's it. Same thing down here, base to final. So kind of talking about the traffic pattern again. If I go, let me copy this. Give me a new page here. Here we go. So here's our initial power reduction or reconfiguration. So we go flaps 10 degrees, start to slow the airplane down, hold the nose, trim it up for about 70, 75 knots. Start to turn in here. Once we're wings level, the first thing, remember, we've got a high ground speed, so we're going to have a higher angle of bank from downwind to base. Something else that students do is kind of piddle around on this first turn downwind to base. You've got a high ground speed here, right? This is your highest ground speed. So if we do a shallow bank, if we can't maintain 10 degrees, what's happening? You're extending your downwind out here, so you're going to drift further from the runway. So again, you're going to get yourself below glide path, and you're going to be further from the runway in the event that you have an engine failure. You're not going to be able to make it. So looking for 20, 25 degrees of bank here. Don't piddle around 10 degrees. Commit yourself to that turn, right? If you have to add a little bit of back pressure because we're gaining airspeed, because remember, we're reducing our vertical lift, kind of getting a little bit of horizontal lift here, you can add a little bit of back pressure and then just release it once you're on your base. Base, next configuration change, wings level, looking for 25 to 30 degrees of flaps. Start to trim the speed up a little, or nose up, speed down a little bit more. Remember, pitch for speed, power for altitude. Once we get to 25 to 30 degrees of flaps, looking for about 65 to 70 knots. And again, once we're there, I'm just using the power. I'm watching my aiming point down here, trying to judge whether I'm high or low, adding power or reducing power as needed to maintain my position on glide path. Something else to keep in mind too, if you have a tailwind, which more than likely we're going to have, this first turn downwind to base is going to be more than 90 degrees. You're going to have a crab angle towards the inside of the traffic pattern to compensate for wind drift, right? So again, more than 90 degrees, high ground speed, so keep a higher angle of bank here. And I think a lot of students, because we put the fear in God of them about turning low and slow in the traffic pattern with that, the graveyard of pilots down here, most of them don't want to overbank, which is good. And I would rather have you baby this, base to final turn in here, but we still have to commit to a turn here so we're not drifting too far from the runway. But look at what we did. If we turn more than 90 degrees, the nose is on the inside of the traffic pattern now. Now my next turn is going to be a lower ground speed because we're turning into a headwind. And it's going to be less than 90 degrees because the nose of the airplane is already on the inside of that turn. So now I don't have to turn more than probably about 15 to 20 degrees to get to the final approach course, right? It's going to be a shallow turn. I'm already fully configured for landing. I don't have to do anything else with the flaps unless I'm doing a short or soft field landing. So from this point, all I got to do is line up with the runway, turn final, and I can add a little bit more trim to make sure that we're kind of slowing down just a little bit more to get to that final approach speed of about 60 knots. And again, now we're talking about that reference, trying to find that center line. Another big thing once we're on final here is maintaining center line, particularly if there's a crosswind. Just like we were talking about attitude flying, that nose to the cowling to the horizon, pretty much the rest of the landing from your final approach down to the touchdown is again an attitude flying procedure with the nose of the airplane. If I see the nose start to walk to the left, what am I going to do? Right? Now here's the thing. If you have a crosswind, the plane is going to weather vane into the crosswind. That's a crab. Some people will ride the crab all the way down. I don't let my students do that because the exact thing that we need to do in this situation is to start to practice with our feet. Another big deficiency of students is not doing anything with the rudder pedals on final approach. This is the only time, or the primary time, that we're using our rudder pedals for directional control of the airplane. So think about your crosswind correction. If we have a left crosswind, where's the nose going to go? If the plane's going to weather vane into the wind, the nose is going to come to the left, right? So in order to get the nose back to the right, what are we going to do? Right rudder pedal. And of course, if we jam that right rudder pedal in there, think about this. We got our plane here. If we go right rudder, that nose is going to come to the right. That left wing is going to travel a little bit further than the inside wing, which is going to generate more speed. This left wing is going to start to roll. So if I add right rudder, the plane's going to roll to the right unless I compensate with left aileron. So if we have a left crosswind, and we say aileron into the wind, that's exactly why. It's not because I need to keep that wing down. That's certainly part of it. We want to keep it from, the wind from getting under the wing and causing it to roll. But the reality is I'm just using my feet to line the nose up with the center line, and I'm automatically correcting with the ailerons to maintain that wing level. Now, depending on the speed of the wind, I might want to have that upwind wing a little bit more or a little bit less elevated than the right wing to compensate. But more or less, I'm just leading with my feet. And they make it some sort of intellectual process to understand crosswind correction. And I'll do that. I'll say, once we're on final, look at the windsock. Okay, is it coming from the left or the right? What's your crosswind correction? They kind of go through this in their head like, okay, aileron into the wind, and then, of course, opposite rudder pedal. You don't even have to think about it if you're leading with your feet. Once you're on final approach, if that nose starts to come to the left, right rudder. And of course, your hands are automatically going to do whatever they need to compensate for that roll by increasing your left aileron, right? So another good example, another exercise that you can do, whether you're a student or a CFI, have the student or your friend or whoever it may be take their feet off the rudder pedals. Tell them to just keep the wings level, right? And you can mash the rudder pedal left or right, and they're automatically going to keep that wings. Again, using that attitude reference out there. You've got a perfectly good natural horizon. You start to mash the right rudder, they're going to add left aileron to keep that nice and level. That's exactly what you're doing in a landing configuration. It doesn't have to be this in-depth intellectual process to figure out what you need to do with your ailerons and with your rudders to maintain center line in a crosswind. Just lead with your feet. And what most people do, they just write it down. I always keep my hands and my feet on the controls, not pressing them, but fingertips on the controls to feel what they're doing. And most of the time, they're not doing anything with their feet. So I have to remind them to use their feet, and then they might put something in, and they'll leave it in there. They'll kind of get refocused on whether the other things they're looking for with instrumentation or their other visual references or what they're doing with their hands, because there's so many things going on. So like I said, I don't let them ride the crab because that's their primary time to practice doing something with their feet on final approach. So I kind of view the landing too in 3 phases. Let me clear this all out. Here's your runway. You've got your approach, you've got your round out, and you've got your flare. Now I know that people like Jason Shapert are like, you need to get flare out of your vocabulary, but what is the definition of flare? Legitimately. Let's see, flare. A gradual widening, especially of a skirt or pants. So that's basically what we're doing here. So if we're on final approach, let's say we're at 60 knots coming in, I'm going to maintain that. If I got my aiming point here, let's say it says 1,000 footers, that doesn't mean, let me rephrase that. If I want to touch down at the 1,000 footers, I've got an aiming point that's usually going to be somewhere in this ballpark. If I want to touch down on the 1,000 footers, I've got my aiming point here. Once that aiming point is kind of beneath the nose, there's no point in staring at that anymore. We're going to start that transition. And again, we're going to start that about inside of ground effects to less than half of a wing's length of the ground. And the goal is to transition to this round out less than a foot or two above the ground if we do it right. You're going to be in ground effect, so it's going to soften that. From this point, this transition, or round out and transition, is to allow the plane to start to bleed off some of that speed. We're still attitude flying the airplane right now, particularly in this point. We're still flying the nose versus that center line, right? Again, variable wins almost always during approach. So if that nose starts to walk to the left, I'm going to add a little bit of right pedal to bring it back over to the center line. Again, automatically compensating with those ailerons to keep the wings level. So that whole point, visual reference down here, transition here, and at this point, once the plane starts to settle back in, when I'm in the round out, I'm going to refocus my eyes from the aiming point down to the end of the runway until I can sense the sink of the airplane. Then I'm going to start adding some back pressure. All I want to do is get the nose up above the main so that the mains touch down first. And the reason I call this a flare is because if you want a soft landing, we're going to keep increasing that back pressure all the way until those mains touch down. Some people say, all right, set your back pressure. The nose wheel's above the mains, just hold it. You can do that. That's also how you get firm landings. And there is a threshold where I'm going to go around. Let's say I round out too high and I'm starting to sense that sink. So I increase that back pressure and the nose is coming up. If that stall warning horn starts getting a little bit louder in the Cessnas, or if I'm in one of the Cherokees and that stall warning light comes on, then I'll probably go around because our angle of attack is getting to the point where we might be risking a tail strike. But other than that, my primary goal from this point on, from the transition, once I sense that sink, is to flare to increase that sort of angle to slow the plane down and touch down on those mains. And that's how you get those soft landings. So you've got your approach, your transition, and you've got your round out here. To me, I would call that a flare. And remember, this whole thing is a ground reference maneuver, right? Using my aiming point down here. Once that's under the nose of the plane, I'm going to transition to start slowing down and bleeding off that residual energy. Now my eyes are looking down at the end of the runway, using the cowling and the center line to keep the nose in alignment with the runway. And as soon as I sense that sink, I'm going to start adding that back pressure. So if the nose comes up and we lose the visual reference to the center line, now we've got what's called the Lindbergh Reference, right? Those sides of the window over here that everybody neglects. You can still see what the airplane is doing in terms of lateral movement with your Lindbergh Reference, using our peripheral vision over here. And this is the same thing that we do when we're climbing out. As soon as you set your climb attitude, right, we're going to use, I can't see over the cowling of the airplane, but how do I know whether I'm staying on course? I'm staying on runway heading. I'm using my peripheral vision. Kind of bracketing over here, you can see if that nose starts to walk left. During the flare, even though I can't see the runway anymore, that's exactly what I'm doing. And of course, if we're doing a touch and go, there's more of this same pitch for power, trim kind of thing, which again, I can't overstate how important trim is for pretty much all phases of the traffic pattern. We touch down, we clean up the flaps, we add full power again. What am I doing? I want VY. I want to give the airplane its best rate of climb for time. Unless I'm climbing over an obstacle. So as soon as I set full power, we're going up again, and I'm going to start to pitch that airplane, and the Cessna's again looking for 73 knots. I'm going to trim 73 knots. So I'm not pushing or pulling the yoke at all. I might hold a little bit of pressure initially to bleed some of the speed off, and then I'm going to trim that pressure off my hand. Same thing when we're turning. I'm not pushing or pulling at all. The only times that I'm pushing or pulling is basically when I'm leveling off, when I'm pushing that nose down to stop my climb, and when I'm sort of rounding out, transitioning, and flaring on the approach. Also, I guess when you're retrimming here too. When you're turning your departure leg to your crosswind, maximum 20 degrees of bank. Again, we've got a low ground speed, but two, you have to remember that you're minimizing or reducing your vertical lifts when you're banking. We're exchanging vertical lift for horizontal lift. So if I do a steep turn, departure leg to crosswind, you're going to stop climbing, or you're going to minimize your climb rate. My goal is to get as much air between us and the ground as I possibly can while I'm climbing here, right? Once we're kind of leveling off here, again, I might add a little bit of pressure to hold the nose down, adjust the power, and then trim it. But again, I'm not doing anything forward and aft on the elevator. The whole goal is to fly with the minimal amount of forward and back pressure on the elevator as we possibly can. And that's the number one thing that I've identified in consistent landings with students. I can feel when they're pushing and pulling, and those are the ones that struggle the most with consistency. Because when we're talking about pre-solo, the criteria isn't mastery of landing, which I can guarantee that wasn't the case for myself. definitely not the case for any of my students. The biggest thing is consistency and safety. Can you put the plane? I don't care if you plant it. Are you hitting that center line, right? Are you consistent with your landings? And consistency, the number one thing that I've identified for consistency is this tendency for people to want to over control the pitch of the aircraft for their speed during your downwind, your base, and your final approach. But that same thing translates to all those other legs of the traffic pattern as well. Climb out, pitch for your best climb, right? VY speed. Crosswind, you're probably getting close to leveling off. Once you're downwind, you can make your power adjustment. Again, the goal isn't an RPM. The goal is a speed. You can adjust your angle of attack as necessary to maintain that speed. So once, we're talking about the Cessna again, if we're 85 knots on the downwind, we've got a particular angle of attack. Once I'm there, the plane's maintaining 85 for me. I'm just going to adjust the power as needed to maintain that altitude. Now, let's say your best glide, for example, is 65 in the Cessna, 65 knots. So if we're doing a no-flap landing, all right, I'm not going to do anything. If I get a beam the landing point and I make that initial power change, right, we make a configuration change, I'm going to hold the nose up a little bit, start to get some back trim, and I might even start that turn while I'm continuing to trim the airplane. What I'm looking for is trim that airplane for 65 so I don't have to push or pull all the way down to the runway. And that's a great example of you're not going to be using any sort of forward or backwards pressure for most of the rest of the landing. I hope that helps some of you guys. Maybe it seems obtuse, but the biggest correlation is, think angle of attack and trim. That is equilibrium, right? The goal is hands-off flying for the most part. We don't have autopilot in a lot of our airplanes, and even the ones that do have it, I don't like using because it feels weird when the airplane is turning itself for me. What I'm basically doing for most of the flight is flying with my fingertips. So you can trim the airplanes that hold a particular airspeed for you at a particular power setting. And even when I'm descending, what am I doing? So sometimes I'll tell students, let's descend down to X altitude coming into an airport. Sometimes new students, they'll start to push that nose down. No. We already trimmed for this airspeed, right? Let's say we're cruising at 105 knots. If you start to pull the power back, just bring it back 300-400 RPMs, that'll probably give you about a 500-foot descent rate in the airplane. You might have a little bit of a Fugoid Oscillation where it kind of dips down a little bit, but eventually it's going to recenter itself on the equilibrium of 105 knots at the same angle of attack for descent. You don't have to do anything with the pitch, right? Just let the nose come down with the power. And of course, when you want to level off from a descent, all you have to do is bring your power back into your cruise setting. And again, it's going to go back to that level flight that you had trimmed, unless you have a big change in pressure altitude. But if you're only talking about 1,000 feet, your level off from a descent is easy. Just increase your power back to your cruise power setting, and you're done. Eventually, that plane's going, again, you might have a Fugoid Oscillation, but eventually that plane's going to recenter itself on that trimmed airspeed. And again, like I said, I'm using that for pretty much every single phase of flight, but it doesn't become particularly important until you get into that landing phase, because a consistent landing is going to be trimming an airspeed. Trim. Trimming an airspeed for a particular angle of attack. If you guys have any questions, leave those down in the comments. Going to make some more videos probably in the coming days. If there's something in particular that you want to hear, I know that one of my students has said about airspace. I'll throw that in there too eventually at some point. Oh, so Mellon raised a good point. He said, what you're saying is exactly what the E bracket on the Hornet puts on your HUD for you. And I'm going to link this video in the comments. When I was looking for videos to send my students, I couldn't find anything that kind of nutshelled this concisely. I found one guy who is an F-18 pilot explaining the way that he does approaches in the DCS Hornet using the E bracket, and that is exactly what he was talking about. And it's weird to me that most pilots, most instructors and stuff on the internet that are doing these instructional videos don't make a point of talking about this, because this is the number one thing that, at least at the commercial level, that I see all of my other friends doing, right? It's trimming for an airspeed. None of us are pushing and pulling the elevators other than to change the configuration of the airplane. Once I've got it, the airplane's going to fly it for me. If we had an E bracket in our training airplanes, it would be telling you exactly that, right? You're just flying the E bracket all the way down to the runway. If you want to decrease your descent rate, add power. The plane's going to maintain the trim airspeed for you. If you want to decrease your or you want to increase your descent rate, just pull some power. It's still going to maintain that airspeed for you. One final thing that I will say, again, going back to angle of attack, here's something dangerous, and part of the reason that you have these problems with inconsistency, and it's that trim. Like I have that one student, for example, that I was talking about that wants to, well, several students, that want to focus too much on the tachometer. Meanwhile, they're kind of either staying at an altitude or they're getting too far from the runway. Maybe they turn final and they realize they're too high. If they're not particularly proficient at a forward slip, one of the things that they'll do is decrease their power to decrease altitude. And of course, I would do that too, but look at what you're doing. If you decrease your power, you're going to increase your rate of descent, which is going to put our flight path somewhere down here. So let's say you hold that high rate of descent down to the runway. If you're at 700, 800 feet per minute descent or higher, coming over the threshold, that's a go-around. That's an unstable approach. Because if we have this flight path down here, if we get low down to the runway and we start our round out, you're going to make an incredibly high angle of attack and you're going to risk stalling over the numbers. You might even have a normal flyaway speed, but that divergence from your flight path to this angle of attack required to arrest a descent from a 700 to 800 foot descent rate is going to cause you to stall. It's going to exceed your critical angle of attack. So in those situations, if I get final and you're high and you're pulling the power, we're coming in over the threshold, you're at 800 feet per minute, go around. Go around. Don't risk rounding out and stalling the airplane because you planned your approach poorly. Here's another thought too. So I talked to this guy. I was in Greenville for a check ride a couple weeks ago, and there was a guy who flew F-8 Crusaders in the Navy in the 60s. And I was talking to him about what are the differences, because he transitioned to a CFI after he was out of the Navy as part of his flying career in civilian life. And he said that for the fighter jets, they're like a pencil. You fly where you point them, right? And that's pretty much the case. And when they're landing, they're using their AOA index there. But for the most part, they have so much excess thrust that they're just pointing to a spot and flying it. And for us, we have to fly it to a point. You fly it all the way down. And I had this DPE for my commercial check ride who he was telling me, when you do your power off 180, if it looks like you planned your approach well, but you catch a gust of wind last minute and you have to go around, well, maybe I'll let you do it again because I didn't really get to see the maneuver and it's kind of out of your control. And he said, planned your approach. But the reality is, that's what this is. That's what this is. We're planning our approach. We're planning this whole process, right? Changing those configurations, trying to get an airspeed, trying to nail that speed and configuration at a certain distance to the runway to maintain that 500 foot per minute descent rate all the way down to the runway. That is a planned and managed approach. Anything else, consider it an unstable approach, right? Those are all things to keep in mind. Like I said, if you guys have some questions or if there's a video that you would like to see in particular about some subject matter, I know probably going to do one about airspace because that was a request from a student of mine. But if there's anything else that you can think of, put those in the comments and I will see you guys in the future. Melon, thanks for hanging around for this little lecture of mine. Hit me up later if you want to fly some Mosquitoes or F-14s. Everybody else, we love you. We'll see you next time. Peace.